process, a more correct and beautiful likeness can be obtained than by any other method. An image of the person, as exact as that formed by a mirror, is transferred to and permanently fixed upon a highly polished silver plate, through the agency of an optical instrument. Only 2 or 3 minutes are required for the operation. The discovery was made by a Frenchman named Daguerre, hence the name daguerreotype, and has excited the wonder, admiration, and surprise of everyone. How valuable, or rather invaluable, would be such a likeness of an absent or departed friend? Specimens may be seen at the rooms and at the Nauvoo mansion. Price only $3, including a handsome Morocco case.
With all Nauvoo mourning their departed prophet and friend, Foster's inferred statement, how valuable, or rather invaluable, would be such a likeness of an absent or departed friend, rings loud and clear. It is worthy to note that Foster states in this ad that specimens of photography may be seen at the rooms, meaning Foster's daguerreotype rooms, and at the Nauvoo mansion, Joseph Smith's house. Since Foster's Main Street studio would have carried a daguerreotype gallery, why would he be showing samples of his craft at the Nauvoo mansion? When the previous sentence is read together with this one, the message comes through. How valuable, or rather invaluable, would be such a likeness of an absent or departed friend? Specimens may be seen at the Nauvoo mansion. Since the daguerreotype of Joseph now belonged to Emma, it would naturally be with her at her house. Those who wanted to view it would have to view it from her. Young Joseph Smith III would have been just under 12 years old when Foster came to Nauvoo. He remembered the daguerreotype and his father's friend Lucian Foster when he stated, "It fortunately happens to us that we know the characteristic likeness of my father by the daguerreotype in our possession, taken the same year, I think 1843, by an artist by the name of Lucian Foster." On the 25th of July, just 3 months after his mother's death, Joseph Smith III took the daguerreotype to the Library of Congress to secure it in his name. He was also preparing to sell copies of it. The most exciting part of this research comes from the files of the Library of Congress. On the 25th of July, 1879, Joseph Smith III deposited 2 albumen copies of his father's daguerreotype in the Library of Congress for copyright. The following data was recorded.
Entry number 9810K, Library of Congress, to wit, be it remembered that on the 25th day of July, Anno Domini 1879, Joseph Smith of Plano, Illinois, has deposited in this office the title of a photograph, the title or described of which is the following words, to wit, Joseph Smith, Mormon, the rights whereof he claims as proprietor, in conformity with the laws of the United States respecting copyrights. 2 copies of the above publication deposited August 6th, 1879.
Joseph III had a patent attorney named E. Thurston or Thornton of 319 Main Street witness the action. According to the law, in order to copyright something, a copy of it had to be placed on file in Washington, D.C. This served as proof to the nation of the copyright. The rules were simple, and anyone could copyright nearly anything so long as they could deposit proof of the item. Proof meant a copy of the item as near the original as possible. This provided no problem for books, as a copy of the book could be deposited as proof. However, it created a bit of a problem for photographs. In order to deposit a photograph, a copy had to be made. This was difficult during the daguerreotype years, but when Joseph Smith III undertook this venture, a new process, the albumen print, was well underway. The albumen process was the forerunner to modern photography. An image could be captured on a negative, enlarged, and reproduced many times. In order to secure the daguerreotype, Joseph III needed the services of William Carson. Carson was an albumen photographer. He reproduced the daguerreotype to albumen paper for copyright. It was one of these albumen prints that the Library of Congress sent a copy of to me. This image alone fulfills all of the requirements needed to be the Foster daguerreotype. The photograph, copyrighted by Joseph Smith III in 1879, is unique for several reasons. First, it was in the possession directly of Joseph Smith III, the prophet's eldest son. Second, it is the only image claimed by Joseph Smith III, the prophet's son, to be a photograph. Third, it is the only image of the prophet deemed important enough by his own family to secure under copyright. Fourth, it contains all the similarities found in images claiming to be artwork or being images copied from the daguerreotype. Go and see for yourself. 6 years after Joseph III secured the copyright, Charles Carter, a photographer living in Salt Lake City, stated that he had a copy of the daguerreotype given to him by Joseph Smith. On the 18th of August, 1885, this announcement appeared in the Deseret News. C.W. Carter, photographer of this city, has in his possession a daguerreotype portrait of the prophet Joseph Smith taken in Nauvoo. 1 month later, he would announce that it was copied from the original daguerreotype. Carter's testimony that he had a copy of this image validates the existence of the daguerreotype as well. Carter had a few drawings made from it, which he sold and later copyrighted under his own name. Carter's drawings are important because they give evidence of what the subject, Joseph Smith Jr., in the original daguerreotype looked like. All of this helps authenticate the actual photograph. Another important clue to the visual appearance of the subject in Foster's daguerreotype comes from a letter written by Joseph III in response to a new painting exhibit in Utah by Louis Ramsey. Sometime in 1910, Louis Ramsey finished a painting of the prophet Joseph Smith. Up till now, the church had never really had a great portrait painter in its ranks, so Ramsey was something of a celebrity. He had studied art on the East Coast, and for what the newspaper called a Mormon boy from Utah, he showed promise. Previous artists like John Hafen and Dan Wegland, though talented, were still considered folk artists. Louis Ramsey was a new breed, the start of Mormon excellence in art, it was said. His portrait of the prophet was hailed as a masterpiece, and until recently hung in the Salt Lake Temple. The Salt Lake Tribune ran the following story announcing its completion.
The above, referring to the painting, is a reproduction of a life-sized portrait of Joseph Smith, the organizer and first president of the Mormon Church. It was finished Wednesday in the studio of Louis Ramsey. It is the first portrait ever made of the subject in which a human touch is given. No authentic pictures are in existence of Joseph Smith, and the artist had to work out his idea from old prints, the death mask, and such other material procurable. Critics of this generation cannot say as to the likeness, but from the artistic standpoint, the portrait is a genuine surprise, and that it will be accepted as genuine art goes without saying, and the picture, which will be exhibited next week, will cause great interest among those who can remember the features of Joseph Smith, who was killed in 1844.
This news article, with a cut of Ramsey's painting, was given to Joseph Smith III at his home in Independence, Missouri. When he read Ramsey's statement, "No authentic pictures are in existence of Joseph Smith," he wrote a response to the Salt Lake Tribune.
Independence, Missouri, March 10th, 1910. Publishers, Salt Lake Tribune, Salt Lake City, Utah. Gentlemen, I notice in your issue of Saturday morning, March 5th, 1910, a copy of which was handed to me by a neighbor, a cut purporting to represent a life-sized portrait of my father, Joseph Smith, painted by a Utah artist. I do not regret to see the picture, but I do regret to know that all the reverence said to be held by the people of Utah toward Joseph Smith, the first president of the church, they know so little about the appearance of the man. I regret the statement that is made, that there is no authentic picture of my father in existence, for this is a mistake. There is an authentic oil painting now in the possession of my son, Frederick M. Smith, at Independence, Missouri. It fortunately happens to us that this portrait, painted in 1843, is sustained in its characteristic likeness to my father by the daguerreotype in our possession, taken the same year, I think by an artist by the name of Lucian Foster. The picture in the Tribune represents a curly-headed man, but my father's hair was not curly. It was quite light in color, and altogether the picture fails to essentially represent the man. That Mr. Ramsay has done well from the material which he had to work with, I can believe, but the expression about the lower part of the face, taken from the death mask, gives too full prominence to the lips and chin. The recollections of the man, so far as Utah is concerned, had been kept alive by flat side views, by pictures originally executed by Sutcliffe Maudsley, an English designer, and a good many of them are but caricatures. I am enclosing a photograph taken from the oil painting referred to. Yours truly, Joseph Smith III.
This letter has caused undue confusion. Many readers interpret it to mean that no daguerreotype exists because Joseph Smith III did not send it to the Tribune. But this is not the argument. Joseph III is not arguing whether there is a daguerreotype or not, but which painting, Ramsay's or the one in his possession, is truer to his father's likeness. He offers his painting as the closest work of art, proof being that it is sustained in its characteristic likeness to my father by the daguerreotype, the photograph, in my family's possession. Well, the point is so simple, the confusion continues even today. I'll never forget in the early 1990s, when speaking with a prominent LDS history senior archivist, he told me that the letter meant that the daguerreotype was a photograph of the painting. I responded that this would be impossible and totally illogical from what Joseph III was saying. If the Smith family's daguerreotype was a reproduction of that painting they owned, it would make their entire argument unsound. Joseph Smith III would literally be saying to the people of Utah, I know that my painting looks more like my father than your painting because I have a photograph of my painting to prove it. What? In this case, anyone would question Joseph III's intelligence, not to mention his entire IQ. Luckily, this is not what he's saying. Rather, he is pointing out quite simply that his painting looks more like his father than Ramsay's portrait does, and that anyone who doesn't believe him can compare his father's photograph to each portrait for himself. This is another very important clue to Foster's daguerreotype. The daguerreotype of the prophet, in the possession of his son, must resemble the painting the family owns. With this lead, back in the 1990s, Chad and I did an extensive investigation into the history of art in America, as we thought it would be beneficial, and it turned out that it was. You can read all of it online or in the book. In the end, our argument back then came down to two things. Everyone admitted that what we had was an image of Joseph Smith. The debate was it an actual photograph of him, or was it a photograph of a painting that the Smith family owned, even though Joseph Smith III said it was not? Our study into early photography became quite in-depth, and in the process we interviewed many talented historians, archivists, and painters, including the Smithsonian Institution and the then Eastman Kodak House. The next argument that was thrown at us against this image came from the fact that the prophet's death mask was being used as a litmus test for any image of the prophet. It was taught at the time that unless the image matched the death mask exactly, it could not be the prophet, since we knew that the death mask was, in fact, the prophet's dead face. This opened up an entire new area of research and actually uncovered a couple of secrets and controversies that became a surprise to all of us. Now, it is no secret that the prophet was severely persecuted throughout his short life. There are many accounts of enemies abusing the prophet physically. Several of the accounts are so brutal it is hard to believe that any man would not suffer bodily damage as a result. Careful examination of the prophet's photograph reveals that the prophet's left cheekbone is lower than his right one. Again, you can see all of these things online or in the book. There also appears to be a scar above his left eye and one on the left side of the Cupid's bow on his upper lip. It is important to note that all of these injuries appear on the same side of the prophet's face. None of these human frailties exist in the painting owned by the Smith family and is today on display at the Community of Christ's headquarters. None of these facial flaws also occur in any other artwork done of the prophet. Such a difference is logical. Artists are not paid to present a man with all his scars and misshapen features. On the contrary, photographers capture life well enough. A fine artist's job is to express the person larger than life. Most painters use the body's inherent symmetry when creating a portrait. They paint the facial features at equal distances given the angle and perspective of the subject. However, real faces are not symmetrical. And when this photograph is cut in two and then reassembled using the same half twice, you can really see how asymmetrical this photograph really is. It was not long before artists in America realized that they could use photography to help speed up their work. Prior to this time, it was difficult for historical figures. George Washington used to lament that he had no more time to sit for paintings. And in fact, he paid to have a life mask made of him that he would hand to painters when they came to his house, and he'd say, "Here, go paint this." Great masterpieces take time. This was a commodity that Joseph did not have. In our research, with the exception of only one sculptor, every artist and art historian we interviewed could not believe that the photograph of Joseph Smith was anything but a photograph. Most of them told us that while the photograph would be a revolutionary piece of art in the 1800s, it made a rather common photograph. When you see it, you'll see that it is beyond doubt that the photograph has been retouched. The prophet's cravat beneath the chin, the dark outlining of the left arm, and the nick beneath his right ear are examples. However, retouching photographs was not uncommon then. Retouching and hand-painting over photographs was part of the artistry that you paid men like Lucian to do. On the bottom right edge of the photograph, there is a very realistic-looking button that is slightly out of focus. Just beneath the prophet's chin is a faded cravat that has been hastily retouched. Since the photographer set the focal plane on the eyes would be the sharpest part of the image. Old studios of daguerreotype used skylights to illuminate the portrait rooms. This light typically came from above and to a slight angle of the subject. This type of lighting can be seen in the prophet's photograph. What makes this point interesting is the fact that when a human being is positioned so that one side of him is exposed to more light than the other, his irises will naturally dilate to equal out the difference. This is a natural response that is not used in painting. Human irises adjust to light by contracting in bright light and expanding in low light. If the light source in a room is coming from the right iris will be smaller than the left one. This principle can be seen in the prophet's photograph by looking in his eyes. The right iris of the prophet is approximately 1/3 smaller than the left iris. Computer enhancements of the prophet's photograph revealed many interesting details. Under digital magnification, one can see what appears to be blood vessels and eyelashes in the eyes. In his coat, there is a tweed pattern and repair stitches along with irregular strands that appear to be coarse wool. Even more interesting information was discovered when the photograph was compared with the prophet's death mask. Shortly after the death of the prophet, a mold of plaster was made of his face. This death mask has been studied and considered by some to be the most accurate image of him. This claim sets up the mask as a litmus test for any image of the prophet. The mask has been compared to many drawings and paintings of Joseph Smith, including the photograph. The photograph does not match the death mask in some important areas. By comparing the two images, it can be seen that the death mask has a more elongated area from the tip of the nose to the end of the chin, specifically the Cupid's bow, or the portion of the upper lip under the nose. This area is wider and fuller in the death mask. The chin on the photograph appears less prominent or shorter as compared to the more forward and the longer prominent chin in the death mask. There are, however, some striking similarities between the mask and the photograph. Plastic and facial surgeons, a forensic pathologist, and a mortician were able to examine the plaster copy of the death mask. One of the experts stated that if the death mask were a fraud, its copy source would have been the photograph, because its image is very similar. Some of the common features of both images, as stated by experts, are 1. The depressed maxillary area of the left cheek, the apparent scar on the upper lip, the left side of the Cupid's bow, a horizontal straight scar on the upper left eyelid, a swelling of the upper left eyelid in the photo with the accompanying death change dehydration of that same area on the death mask. The shape of the chin and jaw are nearly identical, except for the more elongated portion on the mask. Overall, they said, the facial dimensions, such as the distance from the brow to the hairline, the curve and length of the eyebrows, the shape of the nose, and the distance between the eyes and the shape of the lips, etc., were extremely similar. It may be interesting to note that Joseph Smith's history of repeated beatings and his reputation with the sport of wrestling may account for some of these items. The scar on the upper lip, more apparent in the photo, may be evidence of the night a mob tried to poison him by forcing a bottle into his mouth. When he resisted them, they crushed the bottle on his mouth and chipped his tooth. Some experts said that any differences between these two images were actually quite minor and could be explained by the angle of the photograph or some death changes as recorded in the mask. However, the difference of the more elongated face in the mask was a significant difference. To explain this difference, it was necessary to get all the information relating to the mask, the death of the prophet, and the changes that could have occurred after his death. In this, we found a whole new area of study that answered many questions that not only substantiated the photograph, but also substantiated the death mask. While researching the prophet's death, we came across information that Hiram and Joseph's remains were exhumed, examined, and photographed in 1928 by the then RLDS Church. A study of these exhumation photographs show that the prophet's skull is missing the facial area. We considered the possibility that when Joseph Smith fell from the second-story window at Carthage Jail in 1844, he may have suffered facial fractures. Because death occurred only minutes after this event, the bones never healed. As decomposition of the soft tissues progressed in the grave, the fragments fell from the face, leaving a void in the skull. Chad, one of the authors of the research, works in a medical profession that associates him with patients who have facial fractures. He was sure experts in this area would confirm that if Joseph had received facial trauma at the time of his death, it would explain why there was a difference in the lower part of the face between the death mask and the photo. So, we needed to return to history to help us answer this question. There are several eyewitness accounts recording that Joseph fell on his face, head, from the second story of the Carthage jail. These eyewitness stories were told from different perspectives. One of the most consistent aspects of these stories is that Joseph fell or jumped out of the window head first, landing on his head or face, and then, if that weren't enough, he was hit in the face with the butt of a gun or a fist. The first account is from Willard Richards, who was in the room with the prophet as he went out the window.
Joseph attempted, as a last resort, to leap out the same window from whence Mr. Taylor was shot, when 2 balls pierced him from the door, and one entered his right breast from without, and he fell outward, exclaiming, "O Lord my God!" As Joseph's feet went out the window, my head went in, the balls whistling all around. He fell on his left side, a dead man.
When we compare the Richards account to the following, it will become obvious that the prophet's feet went out last, or in other words, he went out head first, falling on the ground below and hitting his head. The second account is from William M. Daniels, an eyewitness. It was published by John Taylor for the proprietor in Nauvoo in 1845.
He seemed to fall easy, and struck partly on his right shoulder and back, his neck and head reaching the ground a little before his feet. He rolled instantly on his face. From this position he was taken by a young man, who sprang to him from the other side of the fence, who held a pewter knife in his hand.
The young man with the pewter knife in his hand mentioned in the Daniels account was named William Webb. He gives testimony of his version of the death that may give another reason for a fractured face.
The door flew open. I saw 2 men in the room. We shot at them several times. At length, one of them fell on the floor. The other, Joseph Smith, jumped out of the window. I ran down the stairs to see where he was. When I got to him, he was trying to get up. He appeared stunned by the fall. I struck him in the face and said, "Old Joe, damn you, where are you now?" I then set him up against the well curb and went away from him. Signed, William Webb.
Another eyewitness, Colonel M. B. Darnell, mentions how he saw the young man, Webb, hit Joseph in the face.
It seems to me Joseph came out head first, and he was shot while passing through the window. On the ground, I think he raised himself to a sitting position. A young man went up and struck him either with the end of his gun or a bayonet.
Several of these accounts also state that after he was hit in the face by Webb, the mob shot him and he fell over on his face again, a dead man. Did the prophet receive facial fractures at the time of his death? The historical record supports the likelihood that he received more than enough trauma to cause facial fractures. When you combine the historical probability of trauma with the fractured condition of the skull, as it was found in 1928, it can be stated, as our pathologist stated, you can come to no other conclusion that he must have fractured his face at the time of his death. The experts in facial fractures and trauma point out that it is no coincidence that the death mask is different from the photograph. The aforementioned areas of the mask are just those areas that change the appearance of a person when they receive the kind of facial fractures that was present in the skull of the prophet. This explains why the mask is dimensionally different from the photo in those areas. For many people, it also explains why so many of the drawings and paintings of the prophet that were done from his death mask do not look like the handsome person that Joseph Smith Jr. really was. The side profiles done by those artists reflect the fractured, distorted condition of the image of the death mask. When the chin is brought forward by some artists in their sculptures and drawings, it is probably done to make him look more handsome. In deviating from the death mask template, these artists were correcting the image and inadvertently making him look more appealing, less dead. As one reads the medical textbooks on facial fractures and listens to the facial trauma surgeons, their descriptions fit to a T the area in question on both the mask and the skull. For facial trauma experts, These are well-known areas of the face that fracture when a person receives a blow to the face. These areas of breakage occur along natural fault lines called suture lines in the bones of the skull. The lines specific to Joseph Smith's trauma are called the Lefort 1, the Lefort 2, and the Lefort 3 fracture lines. When the bones associated with the Lefort lines break, they can sometimes become displaced and movable in the tissues of the face. This bone displacement causes a person's face to look different. In fact, Lefort fractures are characterized by the person's face becoming elongated. They are often associated with fractures of the mandible, the lower jaw, because the force necessary to break the facial bones in a traumatic event may also apply to the chin. This force on the chin usually breaks one or more of the tips of the processes of the mandible where the jaw connects to the skull just under the ears on both sides. All of this is illustrated with the photograph, the death mask, and actual victims of similar events on the website or in the book, so you can see it for yourself. In fact, Joseph Smith's skull and death mask present the classic signs of the Lefort fractures. The elongated face of the mask is evident, as we have stated, when compared to the photograph. His fractured jaw, as illustrated in photographs of his exhumed skull, give evidence of the force of the blow, or blows, that Joseph received during his traumatic death. Even the widened area of the upper lip on the mask, as compared to the photograph, can be explained by displacement of the Lefort 1 fracture line. The mask's profile image reveals the backward displacement of the chin caused by the fractured mandible that you can see in his skull photographs. So, returning to history for a moment, we find an interesting description of the death mask by Joseph Smith Jr., the prophet's son, Joseph Smith III. Again, he knew his father, he lived with his father, and was nearly 12 years old when his father died. He knew him as well as anyone. He knew what his father looked like. Joseph Smith III may not have known about his father's facial fractures, but he definitely had a problem with the distortions created by them when artists reproduced his father's image using the death mask. His description of these distortions caused by an image from the mask can be found in the previously referred to letter he wrote to the Salt Lake Tribune in 1910. Remember this part of that letter? But the expression about the lower part of the face, taken from the death mask, gives too full prominence to the lips and chin. Exactly. Joseph Smith III, the son of the prophet, saw the problem that the Utah Saints had with the confusion over his father's likeness, and he didn't need our experts to explain the problems with the death mask. This facial trauma data solidifies the photographic image of Joseph, but it also helps validate the authenticity of the mask. So that's a summation of actual many pages of illustration and data about this image. This, again, is the only photograph that Joseph Smith's own family said was actually a photograph of him. We can historically and legally tie it directly to the man who authenticated it, his own eldest son, Joseph Smith III. I encourage you to go and look at the image for yourself. I think you'll discover that, somehow, you always knew it. Anyone who takes the time to study this man's soul through his eyes as photographed can in no way disregard the greatness of the prophet. The only hope that Chad, Jim, and I had for this photograph is that it would inspire study and testimony to the divinity of the restoration of the kingdom of God through his modern prophets, beginning with the first of our dispensation, Joseph Smith, the prophet of the Lord.
I really enjoyed that. Thank you for indulging me. Anyone wanting more on this can go to a website, photographfound.com, to see the picture and the associated research from the early 90s. You can also go to our website, gospelfeastbooks.com, and click on the podcast links. And since this season is almost officially over, I still have to remind you of your promise to discuss the war chariot of the Lord that Ezekiel saw, along with the ramifications of its reality. Next episode?
I do try to be a man of my word. Next episode.